Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Developer First Security Week event. This is day 4, and the topic today is the future of data privacy. So it's going to be really excited. I'm excited about the guests we have today. I'll just give a quick intro. I'm Nathan Tarbert. I'm the community engineer at Boxy HQ, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to moderate this discussion that I know you will enjoy. So without further ado, I will bring in our guests and let them introduce themselves. So let me bring in Brian, Deepak, and Joe. Hi, guys. How are you?
Good,
Hello.
thank you.
I'm good. Thank you.
Excellent. So, Brian, let's start with you. We'll go through a round of introductions and just kind of tell us about yourself, tell us about your background, and yeah, go for it.
Well, pleasure to meet you all. Thanks for having me today. My name is Brian Levine. I'm one of EY's cybersecurity and data privacy leaders focused on the transaction space. So I get to look behind the covers at the security and data privacy of hundreds of companies every year, doing due diligence, doing integrations, and doing separations. Prior to joining EY, I was a cybercrime prosecutor with the U.S. Department of Justice and national coordinator for the other 300 cybercrime prosecutors around the country. Prior to that, I was a regulator with the New York Attorney General's office and their Internet and Technology Bureau. And prior to that, I spent about 10 years doing technology and securities litigation for some big law firms. Morrison and Forrester in Palo Alto, better known as MoFo, and Paul Weiss in New York, which is another good firm, but has no funny abbreviation. So I'm really focused on making sure, trying to protect companies and individuals, not only from breaches and data privacy incidents, but the litigation and regulatory inquiries and all that fun stuff that will follow. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Excellent. And Joe, you've got the floor.
Thank you for having me as well. For everyone who may have heard my name before, who might have seen me in The Social Dilemma or through my TED Talk, you want to work for Google, you already do. I've done the last half decade, a little over half decade, 6 years of my life dedicated to data privacy and tech ethics on the internet. Previously, I was a consultant for Google, and just seeing the Valley, not just Google, but the Valley at large, is what has driven my passion to help improve privacy on the internet, because I believe fundamentally it's good not just for business, but also for our democracy and safety of our citizens moving forward. So very excited to talk with everyone today and to do what I can to help educate.
Excellent. And Deepak, you're up.
Thanks, Nathan. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Brian. Super excited to be here. My background is not at all in privacy of any form, but of course, GDPR happened, and 2017, I was CTO at a cybersecurity scale up, which meant that we had to get our data privacy in shape and get prepared for the eventual GDPR. My background has always been technology, developer at heart, still do. And that's why, security and privacy are kind of quite near and dear to me. Having been thrown those things and kind of picking up the expertise over the years, I kind of come from having a very different expertise around it. Not from the legal aspects, but more from the implementation aspects and how that kind of translates to both technology and product. And of course, at Boxy HQ, we deal a lot with privacy, technologies. We have a data privacy vault that architecturally kind of helps you rethink your privacy by design, rethink what GDPR stipulates. So yeah, super excited to be here and have an exciting conversation with Joe and Brian.
Excellent. So I'll start off with the first question. Okay, so with the increased volume and complexity of personal data being collected, how do you envision data privacy regulations evolving in the future to address new challenges while fostering innovations? Joe, would you like to lead in with that?
Sure. I think based on what I've heard in different regulatory conversations, sitting in rooms with senators, helping advise some of this work, is you're just going to see more and more transparency demanded from the governments. Some, depending on, like, I think the EU will head more and more towards prescriptive legislation that they're hoping to actually shape the outcomes of technologies and define the trajectories. But, in the United States, there's a lot of pushback. We don't have legislation. We don't have controls, all these things. And I would argue we do. It's just different. And I think what we're going to see in the US is that it's going to become more and more about reporting and transparency. That being said, I think the biggest thing that companies can do nowadays is start to dig more and more into their vendors. I think that the original privacy laws that were created all around the world were super focused on the company itself, Company A, and what Company A is doing with data, not as much of what happens once the data leaves Company A, right? There's like, just put in the contract in place and let's call it good. So I think the future of it, you're going to start looking more and more into vendors. And that's also what we do at Datagrade, is help companies expedite that, because we believe it will be such a big thing in the future.
Excellent. And Brian, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So, like, what have we seen so far? Let's start with that. And first of all, let me just say, I feel overdressed. I think I'm the only one wearing something buttoned down. But in my defense, I'm not wearing any pants. So maybe it equalizes out in the end. So let's talk about what we've seen already, because that is how we can predict the future based on the present and the past. And so what we've seen is, first of all, an explosion of the type of personal data that is available, that's out there on us right now. I mean, it's really scary, the amount of information, that Google, for example, has, Joe, based on your TED Talk and my work with Google in the past, that all these companies have about us. So we're talking about things, location, right? It's very easy to find people's location. In fact, I was talking to a company recently that you just provide them your phone number and they can tell you if anybody's been following you, who's been following you over the last 6 months or year, just with nothing else. And that's really scary. Facial recognition, companies all over the country, all over the world, know what our face looks like. Bodily cycles, our phone, our watch are aware of our bodily cycles, whether we want them to be or not. There's some news coming out recently, some studies coming out that show that just with the regular Wi-Fi that we have coming into our homes and offices, you could see who's in that home or office and what they're doing. So the idea that we have any privacy is sort of an illusion. It's kind of best to just close your eyes, I think, and pretend that we're private, that we have some. So that's the first piece. Then at the same time, in response to that, we've seen this huge explosion of data privacy regulations. We mentioned GDPR. Of course, that's an ever-evolving and complex piece of legislation. But we've seen, most every other country in the world come up with its own privacy regulation or working on one. Within the United States, we have all kinds of separate data privacy regulations separated by location. Each state is coming out with their own, and there's something like 10 different ones that are effective now. It's not only California anymore, and California is now a CPRA, not CCPA, so they can't even keep the same name. And then it's also sector-based. So we have, the healthcare privacy, we have HIPAA, we have the financial sector, we have GLBA, we have other sectors as well. So it's a very complex tapestry of privacy regulations. And that's on top of, in the United States at least, and probably most other countries, a very well-built common law privacy rules that come through cases that have been decided for hundreds of years, but that are still applicable today. So what are we going to see in the future? First, I think as new technology comes out, we're going to see new regulation around it. And that new regulation is always going to be behind the curve. And everybody's going to complain about that we're chasing after the technology. But I don't see a way to avoid that, because people like Joe and other innovators aren't going to start by going to Congress and saying, I've got this new technology idea. Can you come up with a regulation first, and then I'll come up with the technology? That's not going to happen. So we're going to see new regulations around this stuff. And I think it's, some of it's pretty unique things like artificial intelligence, right? It's a little hard to apply past copyright law and past intellectual property law, past privacy law to AI, just because nobody was really thinking about that 100 years ago when the cases were written, and it's just a little bit different. So we're going to, unfortunately, to some degree, we're going to see new regulation on that. And when it first comes out, everyone's going to hate it. Everyone's going to be like, it came out too slow. It's no good. The Congress doesn't understand technology. The courts don't understand technology. And then it will gradually improve over time. And then the technology will change and it'll become irrelevant. So that's what we're going to see. Then the other thing we're hoping to see, I think, is some consolidation in the data privacy laws and regulations, because other than for consultants like myself and for lawyers who get paid to explain these things and help you comply with them, nobody likes having to comply with 100 or more data privacy regulations. It's just impossible. So I think, we're going to hopefully start seeing consolidation, at least within the United States. So I think, that's what we're going to see, and we'll just keep our fingers crossed it's not too terrible.
Let's hope so. All relevant points. Deepak, do you have anything to add on to that?
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess Joe and Brian covered large aspects of it. I think, I'll just give you kind of my perspective, right? Coming from, as Brian said, not liking compliance regulations. Because it's an inherent barrier, right? We're building things, we're creating. These things slow you down. And they're built to slow you down, right? Because the whole idea is, the reason they're around is because we haven't done the right things as an industry. Collecting data was cheap. So, we've started like collecting terabytes of data. But easy to collect, but what do you do after, right? So not a lot of thought was going into that. And then, GDPR was that first attempt to say, hey, actually, hold on, this isn't going right. You should be really thinking about what you're collecting the data for, what you intend to use it for, and ultimately safeguard it. Because, at the end of the day, the fuel for most companies is data. And that's got to be done in the right way, right? So you can't just go around utilizing it the way you like it, which we have been doing so far. So kind of, the GDPR, I think, was that stepping stone there, I think very much in the right direction. But with that came a whole lot of confusion, right, around. It's very hard for someone like me to decipher what is said there. And to be honest, for some of the experts as well, right? And that keeps changing as well, as Brian mentioned. But I think now we're on that path where we'll see that evolution of data regulations, compliance frameworks, across the board, across all verticals. In some verticals, it's more critical than the rest. Healthcare, fintech, a lot of highly sensitive data. So I think but it's going to take time, right? The regulations, the sort of onboarding time is long. Some countries are still debating, when to release it. These bills have to go through parliaments and get passed. There's going to be obviously opposition to that as well in many countries, but I think it's all largely getting there. And I think the next 5 to 10 years is really going to be the decade of data privacy, right? Where we start to say, let's do good things, but let's start thinking about privacy. Let's start respecting everyone's, because there's so much data out there. And I think that's a step in the right direction. Companies will be kind of forced to rethink, right? What are they doing with the data? How do they safeguard it? For example, now we can see cyber insurances are very strict about showing evidence that you've done the best you could to safeguard data, right? You get breached. That is a reality today. I think we can no longer be on that. I'm going to be passive and try and prevent attacks getting into my infrastructure. You almost have to assume today that you will get breached. So then what happens to the data you've collected so far? So that's why it's so interesting and it's so critical. And I'm quite excited to see what despite not liking regulations and compliance frameworks, see what's up ahead for it.
It's definitely a hot topic, that's for sure. And since Brian was the first one to mention AI, I'll probably lob this one in your direction. But I think we can all agree that AI has the potential to, revolutionize industries, and it has in some areas, and it's seems to be moving at lightning speed. So at the same time, it raises concerns about data privacy. My question is, how can organizations strike that balance between leveraging AI and those certain technologies and ensuring that your data won't be at risk? Brian, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, well, it's a really big problem, and I think it remains to be seen whether companies are really going to be able to keep your data from being at risk with AI. Because the problem is, as I see it, um, if you can just send out an AI agent to troll all of the internet and absorb all that data or learn from it, essentially, given how much data is already out there and publicly available, or can easily be added into a data set if you pay to add it in. The problem is you're going to just end up with the ability to know a lot about everybody. And it's going to become very, very hard to anonymize data or use it in that in a truly anonymous way where we can't sort of wink and nod and figure out who we're talking about here. A lot of people in courts have already said that about with location data alone, that there's no real way, if you have somewhat detailed location data, to anonymize that, because only one person or one couple of people are going to your house every day, and so you just start with that. What they're doing the rest of the day, it's kind of hard to anonymize it, taking your house into consideration. And how many people live in one particular area and then also work on the same building. I mean, you just quickly narrow things down, and you can identify people through big data and AI relatively easily. And then, when we talk about privacy, AI creates a whole nother risk that I think is even bigger, which is like we don't even have just the ability to learn a lot of stuff about the person. We have the ability to actually recreate them. I mean, which is really scary, right? We could take their voice, we could take their image, we can take their mannerisms, and this is why Hollywood. One of the reasons Hollywood is all on strike, because the actors don't want to be replaced by an AI version of themselves, and you won't know that that's an AI Tom Hanks and not actually Tom Hanks. So that's, I mean, and I'm sure the actors, the people on the level of Tom Hanks, will figure that out because they can litigate it with these companies. But if it's you or I who has their image taken, and we become a chatbot all of a sudden, we're probably not even going to know about it, unless somebody tells us. So this is pretty scary, I think. But I think the thing that companies need to think about as they move into this new technology world, and here I'm talking about AI, but any other big shift in technology, are two things. So one is privacy by design. So thinking about privacy from the beginning of implementing these kinds of new technologies, rather than implementing them and then getting complaints about privacy issues and then trying to re-engineer and put privacy back into it, which to some degree, especially with AI, once the genie is out of the bottle, it's really hard to shove that genie back in. Now, the FTC is trying to get companies to shove that genie back in, or use privacy by design initially, by saying, hey, if we find your algorithms have a variety of problems, like they discriminate or they collect information improperly, we're just going to make you give up that algorithm, and you're not going to be allowed to use that algorithm. And that could be quite expensive for companies. So if you don't do it yourself, the regulators are going to try and do it for you. The other thing I think is really important for companies to think about in this world of AI and fast moving technology is, when they're implementing something, when they're doing something with PII, with customer information, with user information, to ask themselves two questions. Would their customers be surprised to learn that this is what is happening with their data? And two, would they be uncomfortable with that? And if the answer to either of those is yes, that's a problem that they have to solve, especially if the answer to both is yes. Because, as you know, you can write privacy policy after privacy policy. You can make it as simple as you want. You could have a movie about it. Customers don't care for the most part. Users don't care. They don't have time to look at all that. And so the companies are going to have to start doing privacy by design and solving these problems in advance for consumers rather than waiting for consumers to complain about them.
All good points. Joe, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I think Brian needs to charge for the masterclass he just put on. That's my first comment.
Thank you, Joe.
I don't know what else to say. No, I'm kidding. No, he covered a lot there, but I think that some things that also people should be thinking about, right? The risk is huge at this point to citizens. I think that a lot of conversation we've had here today and that we're seeing elsewhere is often like we are all insiders to the industry, speaking about what we think should happen to the industry. But if you go take a pulse of the general public, it's very clear that they're upset. And yes, there's always that frame of like, okay, well, these companies are monopolies mostly, so there's nothing the consumers can do. It's, that's why we need regulation. I kind of disagree and to some extent because consumers are needed for the products as much as the products are needed for the consumers. And people are creating alternates to these services nowadays, whether they're small fractional pieces of the service or entire competitors like full scope. And I think that the new world we're headed into with no code, low code, and all these integrations that you're effectively enabling the average citizen to become a developer at this point in history. I do think we're headed towards a world where if companies, regardless of compliance, right, regardless of law, if they don't start providing privacy by design, if they do not start to practice data minimization, if they do not treat customers well, within the next 5 or 10 years, there will be new services stood up by a different generation of developers. I mean, look at all the people that just got laid off last year. Hundreds of thousands of technologists who many times had a lot of stock in those big companies. I talked to a former 16-year at Google employee who got laid off because, he helped create Google I/O and he created a whole bunch of stuff for Google. But, no, Google doesn't need him. Well, he has a lot of stock. He has a lot of money to invest in things. He has a lot of ambition to change things. I think give it 5 or 10 years, we're going to see big competitive products, number one. So it is to your advantage to start to get ahead of that if you're a product company. Number two, like Brian's saying, yes, the legislation is coming out fast. But I think also, like United States wise, I just don't think we're really ever going to get to something as detailed and comprehensive as what you're seeing out of the EU. I don't think that's it's going to be the most American thing I say today, but that's just not how we do things in the United States. We're very business first. And like Brian said, like, I'm not going to Congress. Nobody I know is going to Congress saying, hey, let me help write this law so I can build. They're just building, right? We all do that. And that's how we always have done it here. So I think we will always have looser laws. And to that extent, fingers crossed, right? But I believe that the market usually does pan out in the long term. In the near term, we're feeling quite some pain right now. And there's a lot of confusion and a lot of fear, rightfully so, right? The whole actor situation, the duplication. I mean, I've had companies reach out to me. I write for Forbes. They want me to publicize some of the work they're doing. And they tell me, I literally had one company reach out to me and say, hey, we have created a system that can, 3D model you, and we can use these avatars, and we sell avatars that are modeled, and we pay models. Like it was like $200 or $400. Like we pay them. I'm like, that's like going to student athletes, name, image, likeness, right? For the longest time and saying, we'll give you $200 and we'll make $1 billion. Is that cool with you? And they have no choice because it was right. It was law. They couldn't take money for their name, image, likeness forever. I think this is a huge problem. And some of those things will need to be, like Brian's saying, litigated or at least protected in law. But I think there's also a lot that can be done through innovation. And I believe that we will see that in tools that are created to, for example, flip the surveillance on the surveillance economy, bring transparency, even if you don't want it. I think we're going to start to see a lot more of that, and I hope we do.
Yeah, Deepak, what's your AI take and the risk that comes along with that?
So I saw a very interesting video on TikTok the other day. This person who said, send me a message and I can dox you, as in privately, right? She's not revealing it to anyone. So what she does is looks at social media, Instagram, Twitter, all of your social accounts, right? And then she can basically narrow down, your age, where you probably live, with great accuracy, right? So much so that the folks who are messaging are quite shocked to know that uh, there's so much information about them that they themselves are putting out there. Whilst they do think that they're hiding it, right? Like they probably put up a picture of tone license, cut up license, driving license, but they've forgotten to black out some of those things. So that's kind of the era we are already in, right? Where you you think that you're trying to kind of block out certain things, but you're actually out there, and you don't even need AI to kind of figure these things out, right? It kind of can happen just by a bunch of folks looking at all the data you left behind, your digital trail. Now, kind of coming into AI and the challenges for companies. So the I don't think there's any fundamental difference to the way AI and sort of big data analytics should be handled by companies at a kind of grassroots level, right? But the challenging thing is unstructured data. So AI is very good with unstructured data, and historically, technology has been quite bad with dealing with unstructured data. As an example, right, I was talking to a CTO. They do like conversational bots, but for the finance industry, basically to kind of help with customer support, right? Very challenging because the fact that someone comes in and reveals their gender, even without directly saying it, is now a PII risk, right? Where do they put those chats now? All of that starts to kind of escalate in terms of and cascade down. So I think that is the big challenge for companies to be able to deal with unstructured data, which in itself is super challenging. But a lot of technology is kind of evolving around this. At the same time, unstructured data is a great way to kind of leverage what you already have and add value to it. So it cuts both ways. And I think, like Joe and Brian mentioned, it's not an easy task, but it's something that we will kind of push through and get done, because ultimately technology comes in, matures, and you can start using it. Some companies will wait because they're not at the bleeding edge, and they can't be for various reasons, including compliance. And they will sort of hang back and say, let's see where this goes, let it mature a bit, and then we will jump in and use it in the right way. So I think it's the classic technology evolution that we've been seeing with everything else. I truly believe.
Yeah, good point. So if we kind of move into a security aspect a little bit, it's almost like daily we see news about data breaches, and it continues to be a major threat to individuals and organizations. What are some of the innovative approaches or technologies that could help strengthen data security and minimize the impact of potential data breaches in the future? Deepak, do you want to lead in with that?
Sure. I think we're seeing a big evolution there in sort of the data security and the technology associated with it. Because up until now, it was about utilizing this data. And now, of course, it's what is the right governance, what are the right policies around it. And over the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, there's been an explosion of what is known as PET, or privacy enhancing technologies. So a wide range of technology providers who are kind of coming in with trying to help you with privacy at all stages of your application lifecycle development. For example, we at Box CHQ, we do the privacy vault, which is more of an architectural piece to safeguard, centralize, govern all the data you collect. We had Guillaume from Bearer a few panels ago. They kind of deal with that privacy aspect at a code level. So you're using AI to generate code. they're able to kind of follow that data flow and then go into where does this what is PI data potentially, and then where it could be flowing into. Then you have, data leakage prevention companies that kind of deal with, give us all your, assets, all the SaaS tools that you use. We can, continuously monitor it for any potential leakages and violations, like secrets in your code, or somebody on Slack talking about something that they shouldn't be. Those sort of, technologies. So I think there's a lot happening there. Again, it's, like security, very layered approach. So you've got to have those solutions in the right layers for you. Ultimately, nothing is foolproof, right? So it's completely your kind of process around security, around privacy, and then how you tackle each layer, all the way from writing code to kind of then deploying it and pushing it out to your customer, and then the data coming back in. So I think, we will see more and more companies in this space, and at the same time, legislations and regulations and compliance kind of, it's going to be a back and forth, right? Technology comes up, there's innovation, which will kind of sometimes lead the way, and then, compliance kind of catches up, and then we're back, right? So it moves back and forth there.
Yeah. And Joe, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, a couple points there. So I think, I heard Deepak had brought up the concept of anything you say in Slack becomes now problematic, right? There's all these new layers, especially with conversational interfaces, that create new risks, unstructured risks that most companies are not ready for. And even with the proper tooling, still it's limited. Some interesting technologies to get specific. I know I have a friend who runs a company called Private AI, Patricia Thane. I think it's one of the most interesting tools I've seen recently. They create more or less like a middleware that can sit between whatever data you're pumping through different APIs, and it will scan it for any potentially risky data, PII or legally sensitive or HIPAA controlled, anything like that. That stuff I think is going to become more and more popular, just having kind of like a middleware kind of layer to all your technologies that allows it to watch and monitor, redact, etc. as necessary. There's also tools, and I actually forget the name of this one. I can go look it up, put it into a post conversation. But I saw a lot of tools at the Rocky Mountain Information Security Conference recently, where probably 3 or 4 of them were actually no-code security tools. So that's super interesting to me, because you're taking security, which is a very technical department, and making it something that you can start to bring out to the rest of the team, the company at large. I think part of the problem with security, actually, I don't think I know, one of the biggest problems with security is that it resides within the security team. Maybe the lawyers know a little bit about it too, but that's about it. In reality, your biggest security threats are your day-to-day employees and the third parties that they engage with. So the more that we can make it accessible and inform others, the more that we can actually have a secure internet. Of course, that's decades of literacy and education to come, but I'm happy to see companies moving that way. I think that's very important.
Interesting points. Brian, I know you have something
Yeah.
to add on to that.
I always do. So I agree with all the points that have been made. So in terms of cyber technology improving, I think it's always going to just be a cat and mouse game. It's just going to be, we make an improvement, the cyber criminals or insider threats figure out how to get around it, and it's going to be an ever evolving hamster wheel. I'll give you an example. I prosecuted a Romanian who went by the moniker Master Fraud. That was actually his email address, masterfraud@gmx.com. And I'll just tell you, by the way, if any of you are thinking of committing cybercrime, don't. But if you do, don't pick a moniker like Master Fraud, because as cool as that will be to your friends, once you get caught, it really eliminates a lot of available defenses. But in any event, this was like 10, 15 years ago. And one of the things he needed to do was generate hundreds of thousands of email accounts in order to do phishing emails and add to his botnet, his army of infected computers. And so he had automated scripts to do that at AOL, America Online, which is how our grandparents used to get onto the internet. Some of them still figured out how to use America Online to do that. And AOL figured this out eventually, so they added a CAPTCHA requirement that you have to fill out you have to guess the image of the word in order to create the account. So it's an example of we put in the countermeasure. So what he started doing, Master Fraud, was paying people in India 1 cent to solve per CAPTCHA to solve these CAPTCHAs. They didn't know why they were solving them. They were just solving these CAPTCHAs. And then a professor in the US wrote a paper about how you could use artificial intelligence to solve these CAPTCHAs. And he read the article and just started using artificial intelligence to solve the CAPTCHAs, putting all those Indians out of work who are getting the cent per thing. So it's just going to be, that's an old example, but it's kind of crazy that even back then in something as simple as CAPTCHA, quickly evolve a solution too. So I think whatever we come up in terms of cybersecurity, zero trust, data loss prevention solutions, it's quickly going to be a sort of an iterative thing. But I think where I've seen some promise is the idea of using or retaining less PII, less data. I think that's beginning to become fashionable, and adequately encrypting what you are using it. And I think there's been a lot of technology around that. So first of all, synthetic data. More companies are using synthetic data, especially in their development environment. Why use real data there when your development environment is never as secure as your production environment, in my experience? So synthetic data. There's also something called homomorphic encryption, which is getting better and better, I understand. And what this does is it allows you to encrypt PII or whatever, but still get useful information from the data without actually decrypting it. It's kind of like a magic trick. I expect to see David Blaine, coming up to people on the street and doing a card trick with homomorphic encryption. I don't know how effective it actually is, but I hear it's getting better and better, and I think that's going to make a big difference if you could actually do that effectively. So the data is never decrypted. Data minimization, of course, and Joe works with third-party vendors and assessing the data privacy of third-party vendors, and that's super important. All the regulators agree that that's super important. But one of the things we're doing is oversharing with third-party vendors unnecessarily. We're it's too much effort to just give them the fields of the database they actually need, so we give them the whole database. And that's something we just got to stop doing. It's pretty easy to do, and I think we're going to see more of that going forward. And then Deepak talked about data mapping. One of the biggest problems is companies don't even know where their data is. I do diligence all the time on companies, large and small, and we ask them questions about where their data is and do they have a data mapping? And the answer is they don't know where their data is exactly, and they don't have a data mapping per se, nothing that they could just kind of show us. And so they're now coming out with tools that help with automated data mapping. They're not perfect, but they're better than using your summer intern to go around the office and start asking people where their data, where did you lose your data? Where did you hide your data? Where do you keep it? Having him look under the desk, look in the drawers. So it's a good place to start. So we are seeing things that I think will be helpful, but that cat and mouse game is never going to end, in my view.
Can I add a note on that real fast?
Yeah.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, so you brought up the whole thing of it's a cat and mouse game, and I think that's 100% true. Everybody should keep that in mind because there's all these big sales pitches, Web3, blockchain, all these different technologies coming out to solve the problem. Well, for the longest time we heard blockchain's unhackable, and look what we've seen over the last couple of years, right? Even your NFTs that nobody could ever lose value on, it could never be stolen, just money just disappearing, right? One thing I always bring up, and I've brought up to regulators who ask me this question too, because they're less technical, is when the early days of the Mac came out, everybody said the Mac's not hackable. That was never true, right? Actually, what was going on was that there were not enough people using Macs to where it was valuable for the cyber criminals to go and learn how to hack a Mac. Well, that's totally changed nowadays. And no matter what technology you integrate or use, if it's been built, it can be unbuilt. So I think that's the core of what I think highlights here, and Brian brought it up, was just don't collect as much, don't store as much, minimize it, get rid of it if you don't need it, share only what you need to share. I think that those are the core principles that are like unsexy. It's like, your doctor saying eat more vegetables, but it's just like, that's all you really need to do and your life changes, right? So just, I'd put a note on that.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I'd love to add one more. I think Brian brought up a very interesting, homomorphic encryption. Super favorite topic of mine, but we're not quite there yet. It's going to be a while. Then there's complexity with quantum computing coming about as well. That has huge implications for the existing cryptographic techniques, which will all basically be obsolete overnight. But again, there's some time there, right? But there's basically, we talk about the trinity there, the holy trinity of data, data at rest, data in transit, and then data in use. And we've largely solved, data at rest, you can encrypt it, like Brian already mentioned. Data in transit, again, SSL, right? SSL, TLS certificates. That's how the browsers work. Keeps your data safe between, in transit. But we haven't yet solved data in use, and that's the big one, which homomorphic encryption promises to solve, but is, from a practical standpoint, is a little far away. You can today already do a few of those techniques, right? Like being able to encrypt but search parts of it. A classic example is, let's say you have a phone number, you don't want to reveal the phone number, but the prefix is okay, right? It's one of the US states, that's the prefix. So that's okay. So you can keep the prefix, encrypt everything else, and you're still able to search on the back of prefix. Or you could do.
I was just going to ask Deepak, because Jose asked, and I didn't know the answer to it, is homomorphic encryption quantum computer resistant?
Oh,
Anybody know?
That's a very good question. At the moment, probably not, because it's still based on the existing encryption techniques we know. But as soon as quantum, because there's obviously post-quantum cryptographic techniques as well that are catching up. So you could use that same encryption algorithm to kind of get the same, because homomorphic encryption is basically about never decrypting data and still be able to use it. Super hard problem, because it's today you could do simple arithmetic with it, but nothing more.
Okay.
So the existing ones probably are not quantum computer resistant, but as soon as that catches up, they will be. Just like today, SSL can be broken with quantum computing, right? So the same concept there.
Gotcha. Okay. Good points. I had another question. So the concept of data ownership and control is becoming, more relevant in discussions about data privacy. And it's very relevant to this conversation specifically. So I have just like a quick little interesting story. I took a look at the National Conference of State Legislators, and specifically the state that I live in, which is Florida, regarding the Consumer Data Protection Act, after watching one of your TED Talks, Joe, actually. And what I uncovered was pretty interesting. So the state of Florida, they banned the unlawful use of DNA, but the law related to the consumer data privacy portion of it actually failed. So, so it got voted down. So if I understand it correctly, the state has chosen not to protect its citizens, which made me question a couple things. Like, I don't want to get political here or anything. But, what do we do? What can we do to protect our data that we leave? We left ourselves vulnerable because, the state itself won't protect us. So, Joe, would you like to lead in with that?
Sure. Some more veggie advice. Just don't put your data online that you don't want online. That's one thing. But the other side of it too, deeper, more technical conversation, I suppose, is like getting the value of data out of these companies and into your pockets is quite difficult. There are definitely companies who are trying to build tools that are by default paying their users or giving you some kind of cut for it. But from a legal perspective, I've sat in rooms and we've talked about, we actually got the first proposal for a full-blown data tax in New York State year and a half, 2 years ago. I thought it was DOA, and more or less it was, but it's caused a big conversation. Got brought up again this last year, and now we have Paul Romer, the former chief economist of the World Bank, backing it because his conversation points are, similar to the financial markets. This is an asset, and at some point it does need to be taxed. What you're hearing from a pushback from industry and from all their lawyers is a couple things. There's the interstate commerce clause, and how are you going to manage all these taxes and how they go back and forth from state to state and blah, 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 blah. Because, different users are technically like purchasing or using in different states, but your company's here and there. So that's one thing. The other side is, and this one blew my mind, but freedom of speech, right? You're limiting freedom of speech by taxing data. Effectively, that these companies are not allowed to express themselves. So the claim there is that these companies believe in freedom of speech, but in that they also believe that they own all that data, which is considered freedom of speech. And that is their freedom of speech. So it's kind of an ironic position that they've brought, but legally, no one really has any precedents to fight it at this point. There's a lot of creative conversations going around it. But yeah, just think about that conversation there for a second. You have companies who are direly pressing the First Amendment freedom of speech, which is very hard to put any pushback on until you have a very sound argument against it. And their argument is literally that they own my data as their freedom of speech. So it will be very interesting how this plays out in court over the next 5 or 10 years. But legally, yeah, I don't see an immediate path to getting people value for their data. This may be another one, though, like as I mentioned previously, where you have new tools that get stood up and consumers start to move over and migrate to tools that do pay them. One quick just kind of numbers to think about here. We've seen conversations about a UBI, Universal Basic Income, if you haven't heard that frame, and I'm not a big fan of it. But think about it, like I believe data creation will be the future of blue collar labor. If we're worth, let's say, $180 a year to Facebook, it's probably fair to say we're significantly less valuable to a lot more companies. But there are millions of companies that probably touch our data every year. So let's say you're worth 25 cents on average and 50,000 companies touch your data each year. That's $12,500 in more or less passive income from the data that you created, which then those companies turn into value. If we can at some point express that value properly and translate it so that consumers, active users, are paid for the data that they create, I believe it at a minimum can be a passive income that gets rid of the need for something like a UBI, but at a higher level, maybe even becomes full-blown working opportunities. And the reality is we need data to fuel the future of this internet. I'm not anti-data. I'm not anti-use, collection, sharing of data. I'm pro-protection and proper privacy practices, and if we can then figure out how to also compensate people for the work that they've been doing, it's just icing on the cake.
We will need a solution to the fact that AI is going to take all of our jobs. So there'll only be so many jobs out there, and if privacy, if data, if a tax on data ends up being a part of that solution, that'd be great. Although I am skeptical that the data of people who don't have a job, so don't have disposable income to spend on whatever it is people would use with that data, that they're going to get so much money for that data. But it is a problem we need to solve. Getting back to the kind of the larger question about how can individuals have more control over their data, be more empowered with respect to their data, it's a big problem because while people care about privacy at some level, like not enough to read a privacy policy. I mean, and think about it. I looked it up, and the average U.S. person apparently visits 130 websites per day and has 80 apps on their phone. So if they were going to, like, it would take you your entire life plus to review the privacy policy of every website and app you visit, no matter how simple those apps are. And then even if how simple those privacy policies are. And then, even if you read the whole thing, you're like, all right, I don't like this company's privacy policy, but I need to use this. This is my bank, so I need to use it. Or this is my email account. I can't quickly change email accounts from Gmail to, Yahoo Mail without sending everybody an email. It's not that easy to change providers, regardless what the rules are about data exchangeability under GDPR, under these statutes. So people don't have time to read policies, even if they're really simple. Yes, of course, if one company is paying you straight out to use your data, then that will be appealing. So I think, part of the solution is going to be to have default settings in phones and in browsers so that we can make our preferences known once. And then after that, we're just making exceptions. The pop-up comes up and says, you don't normally share your location data, but if you want to know an ice cream store near you, you're going to have to hit yes to share your location data or enter your zip code, because there's no other way we can tell where you are. So I think having this sort of default settings that would apply to everything, and I think there's a lot of efforts by a lot of different companies to try and do that. Apple has tried to do that with the iPhone. And then there's also privacy enhancing technology that starts at the computer level or at the phone level that you can just turn on by default, and it's going to help in a lot of situations. For example, and I guess I'm revealing that I have an iPhone based on the examples I'm using, but Apple, for example, has a private relay where they claim, at least, that it works a lot like Tor, where if you browse through their browser, through the Safari browser, and you turn the private relay on, it's not projecting your real IP address. It's projecting a IP address that Apple controls, and Apple is also not getting the information about where you're visiting. Don't anyone use that to commit crimes, because A, don't commit crimes, but B, it kind of turns on and off, I find. So like you don't know exactly. I wouldn't rely on the fact that it's working at any given moment. But Apple also has a system now where it will help you generate automatically a disposable email address to use with service providers that you don't want to give any personal information to, but you want to use that service. So I think the more these companies at the starting point of our journey into the internet and into the app worlds are baking in privacy protective technology, and we can make those decisions once or twice and not 130 times per day, the more we'll be able to kind of have control over privacy from an individual perspective.
Really good points. And we have a bunch of questions actually in the chat, but what I'll say about that is if you can ask those questions over on Boxy HQ's LinkedIn, then maybe Brian or Joe can answer a couple of them because they're specifically targeted at your expertise, Deepak, as well. But we only have a couple minutes left, and what I wanted to do to start closing us out was I wanted to thank Joe Toscano from Datagrade, Brian Levine from UI Parthenon, and Deepak from Boxy HQ.